For those of you who were here the first time round, will remember Todd works for Telerik, and he's the chief evangelist there. As usual, we have the normal slides to get through, so we'll just quickly flick through them. Right, on October the 20th, we've got Jeremy LIDNUG coming along to do a segment on isolated storage for object databases in Windows Phone 7. That should be good. Don Simon Luke Hoban on October the 27th, presenting an article on F#. And then the big guys back in November the 10th, Scott Goo talks shop. That'll be for the 4th time this year. As you know now, Scott comes back to us every quarter. As per usual, we've got all the normal links and that here. We've got our website, we've got the calendar links, we've got our Twitter feed, we've got Facebook feed. Email is info@lidnug.org. And as you know, the site's homepage is on the web, on linkedin.com, group number 43315. Okay, so without further ado, are you ready, Todd?
Absolutely. Let me go ahead and load up my content.
Right, if you just want to go ahead, we've got the Q&A open. Same as it was last time you were here. Enjoy.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for attending today. I want to especially thank everyone for attending on a slightly, I think, unusual day for LIDNUG meetings, this being a Tuesday instead of the normal Wednesday. I happen to be jumping on a plane in a few hours to head off to Edmonton, Canada for Tech Days Canada. So if you're in Canada and near Edmonton, join me tomorrow for Tech Days Canada. We'll be talking more ASP.NET. But today's plan is to talk about what's new in ASP.NET 4 and specifically how you can make the most out of what's new in ASP.NET 4. So if you've not yet checked out the ASP.NET 4 bits, or if you've only lightly checked them out and you want to see a little bit more in action and understand more deeply what some of the new features and changes mean, then that's what today's session is all about. And while some people are still arriving, I'll go ahead and cover just a few business items to introduce myself, make sure you know where to connect and find me online afterwards. First of all, as mentioned, I come to you from Telerik, and I'll introduce Telerik for those of you not familiar in just a moment. But if you're not connected with Telerik on Twitter or Facebook, we're active there, so I encourage you to do that at Telerik on Twitter and facebook.com/Telerik there as well. Great place to plug in if you're a Telerik fan or if you're just interested in trying to win free stuff. We're always running different contests, and it's a great place to plug in for that. Before we get into more sort of introductions, just a little slide to kind of set the stage for how you can get the most out of what we cover today. Some of you may have seen this slide before, or at least a chart that looks like this. It often shows up in textbooks. What it suggests is that in today's presentation, really in anything that we go and set out to learn about, we generally only remember about 10% of what we read and about 20% of what we hear. Or to put it another way, if all you do is watch the screen today, you'll probably forget at least 70 to 80% of what I cover. So that's fine, that's great. What you can do to maximize what we talk about today is actually experience it for yourself, and that's the way to really retain the most. So I encourage you to pick at least one thing we talk about today and go ahead and just give it a quick try in Visual Studio, pop it open, see if it makes sense, and that way you can actually retain and get something out of the time we spend together today. For those of you who like to know the prove-it facts behind different charts, I did the research on this one, and it turns out that the numbers here are actually bogus. There's no real research behind them, at least not any legitimate research. But nonetheless, I think it's pretty intuitively true, so I encourage you to try what you see today. As mentioned, my name is Todd Anglin. I'm the Chief Evangelist for Telerik, also a Microsoft MVP, an ASP.NET Insider, President and founder of the North Houston.NET User Group, which is where I come to you from today, just north of Houston, and an O'Reilly author in Silverlight. If you want to connect with me online, I blog most often at TelerikWatch.com, and I am also on Twitter. And I imagine this group is a little bit more plugged into Twitter and some of the online resources than most, so please feel free to connect with me at Todd Anglin on Twitter. In fact, since this is the LinkedIn.NET User Group, I should also mention if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please feel free to do that. I'm happy to connect with you there as well. If you're not familiar with Telerik, I usually include just one slide to just let you know who I work for and what we're doing, so you know where I spend my time, and gives you a little bit of an understanding of my perspective looking at some of these technologies. I imagine many of you on today's meeting are familiar with Telerik, or at least you've been familiar with Telerik in the past. The LIDNUG website, I notice, does run on Sitefinity, and I've seen the Telerik controls used throughout LIDNUG in the past, so you've had some exposure to some of Telerik's tools. What we're really aiming to be for you, the developer, is your one-stop provider for .NET tools and UI components. So that means that when you get a project, regardless of platform, whether it's ASP.NET 4, like we're looking at today, or Silverlight, or maybe you have to do some data access, we have tools that help you, the developer, save time and produce better software. So the UI side, that means we continue to have industry-leading UI components for ASP.NET Ajax, ASP.NET MVC, WinForms, and the XAML platforms, Silverlight and WPF. On the data front, we provide basic BI support with Telerik Reporting, which works across all the major Microsoft UI platforms, including Silverlight, and Open Access ORM for doing very easy but very powerful data access. To save you time as you start writing and doing some coding, in fact, this slide's a little out of date here, we have Just Code and Just Mock, two tools for Visual Studio that help you with writing code and unit tests. If you want to actually do functional testing, that last step that you should do to make sure your software behaves the way you expect it to, we have Web UI Test Studio to help you automate your UI testing of Silverlight and ASP.NET, or really just HTML. And of course, to help ensure that all this is being done in a productive way, if you're a TFS shop, we have two free tools you should not miss, Work Item Manager and Project Dashboard. Great things to plug into your workflow to help you save time as you work with TFS. Sitefinity CMS, you guys are familiar with it, you're running your website on it. But really, all this falls under the banner of making you, the developer, more productive. And I like to use the term developer why. You, the developer, typically is not so much your money as much as it is your time. So what do you get out of the time you invest to learn tools? We think the Telerik tools give you the most back for the time you invest to learn them. So that's Telerik, that's who I work for, and hopefully if you've not checked Telerik out or not checked them out recently, you'll jump on over to telerik.com or to Twitter or Facebook and check out some of the stuff we're doing. But today's roadmap is to talk about, as I said, what's new in ASP.NET 4, and here's how we're going to get through the content. We're going to start by setting the stage and talking a little bit about the web developer landscape. And that's essential, really, when we talk about the evolution of ASP.NET, because a lot's changed since the original introduction of ASP.NET, so it's important we understand where this all fits in. I'll then move on to providing a just high-level overview of what's new so that we can progress into looking at least 7 to 8 demos of some of the newer major features in ASP.NET 4. Among those demos will be some new APIs, new controls. We'll try to make sure we take a look at how dynamic data has been improved and been made more usable for web forms developers. And then if we have time and interest, we'll touch lightly on jQuery and MVC, though the focus of today's presentation will primarily be on the web forms features of ASP.NET 4. And we'll try to leave with at least some eye towards what's next. I know it's always tough to sometimes absorb what's now, that we shouldn't be worrying about what's next, but technology is always evolving, so it's important to at least have some idea of what's coming down the road. So that's how we're going to spend the next hour or so, I guess hour in change, and we'll cover as much as we can and hopefully address as many questions as we can as well. If you have questions that are going out throughout today, make sure you log those in the Q&A manager. You all are probably familiar with that, but just in case you're not, and we'll try to address as many of those towards the end as we can. So a starting point to really establish what we're talking about today, when we talking about ASP.NET and the evolution of the web and ASP.NET 4.0, sometimes it's important to just kind of step back and say, what are, in fact, the technologies of the web? ASP.NET is certainly a way to go about building websites, but what are the fundamental technologies of web development? And if we were together in a live setting, I could poll you and we could come up with some on-the-fly answers, but I'll just go ahead and provide you with the fundamentals. When we talk about web development, we're really talking about HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's these three technologies that really combine to produce what we know as web development. So when we look at something like ASP.NET, and we think of ASP.NET through the lens of server controls, or the various ways we interact with ASP.NET, really we're looking at an abstracted layer to writing or targeting, I should say, these technologies. ASP.NET's rendering our HTML, our CSS, our JavaScript for us, so it's taking us a little bit away from the fundamental technologies of the web, but ultimately, to be a good web developer, these are the three technologies you really have to understand. In fact, I would argue today it's even less about understanding JavaScript as much as it is understanding jQuery. That's a little bit of a nitpick, but jQuery truly has become almost like the abstracted layer on top of JavaScript, which everything else interacts with. So if we were to take an even more comprehensive look and we were to walk down memory lane and kind of figure out how we even arrived at ASP.NET in the first place, probably one of the best places to start would be in 1991. And if you're not familiar, what's significant about 1991? It's the birthplace, really, of the web. And here, the original web server, Tim Berners-Lee's web server, the Nextcube. Trivia fact that you can tweet and share with your friends or impress the guy in the cubicle next to you. The original web server cost $6,500. That's how much it cost to start the internet. And that's where we found the fundamentals of HTML, the technology which we still use today fundamentally for declaring markup and laying out our web experiences. Fast forward to 1993, and then we started the beginnings of the technology that really unlocked what's become the web that we know with the Mosaic browser. And the Mosaic browser became the underpinnings of what eventually became Netscape. And obviously, we all know how Netscape and IE and the original browser wars played out. But it was this evolution of making it more than just text, making it an experience that really laid the foundations for the web that we all interact with and develop for today. 1996 was significant because we had the introduction, or really the adoption or implementation of CSS, one of those second peer technologies. So HTML, CSS. CSS was first widely implemented in IE3. So while we've come a little bit of ways, or maybe IE's lost its way a little bit throughout history, there was a time, 1996 specifically, where it was the leading browser supporting CSS. In fact, another trivia question for you. What was the first browser that fully implemented the CSS 2.0 spec? I'll give you a minute to think about it. And the answer is IE for Mac. So believe it or not, IE for Mac was the first CSS2 almost 100% compliant browser. Also significant about 1996, we had the introduction of ASP Classic 1.0. So here's the introduction, 1996, more than 10 years ago, where we had the introduction of the first dynamic way to writing web pages from Microsoft. And that obviously was part of Service Pack for, I believe, IIS3. Fast forward to 1998, Google hits the scene, search engines start to explode, the web starts to explode, content's becoming more dynamic, more web pages are being visited all the time. The need for fresh and up-to-date content is all the more important, which takes us to 2002, the introduction of .NET, and of course ASP.NET. So now, almost 10 years ago, not quite 10 years yet, we had the introduction of the fundamentals of ASP.NET that we continue to work with and evolve and develop for today. So at the time of ASP.NET 1.0, 2002, 2001, JavaScript was a pain. But realistically, IE6 at that time held a 96% share of the browser market. So while it was a pain to write for if we wanted to support 100% of the browsers, really we had this luxury for a short period of time where there was essentially one browser, so we didn't have to experience that pain if we could ignore the other browsers around IE. But nonetheless, JavaScript was a pain, and we all remember the pain of jumping through all the hoops and the hacks to make JavaScript work, which was part of the attraction of ASP.NET 1 at the time, is that it wrote our JavaScript for us. It allowed us to get away from all those unnecessary or painful JavaScript battles. .NET was also brand new, and that sounds a bit quaint, but it's a very interesting thing to think about. When we first started using ASP.NET, not only was ASP.NET brand new, WinForms was brand new, and one of the most popular programming models for the Microsoft developer ecosystem was VB6. I imagine there's still some of you here today who still support or maintain VB6 applications. So I say that because that puts sort of in the frame of reference what was happening around the time that ASP.NET's processing model and programming model and approach to web development was being crafted. VB6 was the big popular kid on the block, WinForms was new, .NET was new, and ASP.NET's design sort of fell in line with that. Yet to be invented in 2002, AJAX, or at least the collection of technologies we know as AJAX, jQuery, Web 2.0, and that could be debatable for better or worse. Silverlight and XAML are really the explosion of the rich plugin as being an application host more than just a simple animation tool. and Twitter. So some things definitely are better or worse from what have not been invented, but nonetheless, just that top list of technologies, AJAX, jQuery, Web 2.0 concepts, fundamentally change the way that we approach the web. So it's realistic to expect that from ASP.NET 1.0 to where we are today with 4.0, a lot probably needs to change or should be changing in ASP.NET. Unfortunately, it is. If we were to look at it as just a smattering of the terms we think about today as we talk about today's web, especially as we start to talk about HTML5 and CSS3 and the integration of social media, working with JSON web services, the second emergence of browser wars, is a very exciting time to be doing web development because it's another very active and fundamentally shifting time in web development with lots of new options, lots of new technologies. And as developers, ultimately, we still need a tool and technologies that help us be productive while approaching and adopting all these concepts. And fortunately, as today's topic will show, ASP.NET 4 helps us address that for the modern web application. So let's talk a little bit about ASP.NET 4 now that the stage has been set. And Yvette's requesting control. I don't think I can give it to you. So, question. What is ASP.NET? And I put that out there simply so we can make sure we're all on the same page, because ASP.NET today is actually a little bit more of an umbrella term. There are many flavors of ASP.NET today, including web forms, MVC, ASP.NET AJAX, we could say the AJAX client-side libraries, dynamic data, and underneath all of these, or underpinning all of these, is the ASP.NET core services. So there are certain things that are broadly true and usable across all flavors of ASP.NET. But ASP.NET today has a number of different approaches or a number of different variants which you can choose depending on your preferred style of web development. So I'm not suggesting any one of these is better or worse than another, but it's important to understand that fundamentally all of this is ASP.NET. So many of these changes and many of the things new in ASP.NET benefit all flavors, but there are unique differences about each ASP.NET flavor you choose to use. Today, primarily, we'll focus on web forms. And as I mentioned, web forms really is more of the abstracted approach to web development. In fact, if we're talking about web forms pre-ASP.NET 4, so everything up through ASP.NET 3.5, then we might have been able to lay it out on a pendulum like this, where HTML and JavaScript, or writing raw HTML and JavaScript, were on-the-metal approaches to web development, actually developing for the browsers. And ASP.NET Web Forms is our fully abstracted approach where we hardly wrote any HTML or any JavaScript, and we let ASP.NET write all that for us. And ASP.NET MVC was somewhere in the middle, letting us get a little bit closer to the metal, taking a little more control over the HTML and the JavaScript, but still helping us with some of the repetitive tasks so we didn't have to do everything by hand. This snapshot is essentially what ASP.NET Web Forms in relationship to MVC and on the metal looks like in the 3.5 era. So 4.0 starts to change that. And in my opinion, ASP.NET 4.0 is all about putting you, the developer, back in control of how ASP.NET behaves. So for instance, ASP.NET 4 introduces a brand new approach to how you can control ViewState. And each of these things that we have listed here we'll look at in more detail in demos, but just to provide some high level, you can now take a much easier approach to being disciplined about what goes into ViewState so that your applications are better performing, so you don't put as much data into ViewState. There's lots of benefits to making sure that ViewState's clean. Control IDs can now be better controlled for rendering so that you can make it easier on yourself when it comes time for you to do client-side programming, which is a fundamental shift in how we're doing web development today. Caching and extensibility kind of go hand in hand. Extensibility has become a major tenet of ASP.NET 4.0. How controls render, how URLs render, all of these things give you more control today than you had in previous versions of ASP.NET. So fundamentally, what it means is that if you don't like the way ASP.NET is doing something, today, very likely, you can change that, whereas in the past, you were kind of stuck. You had no option to change. Furthermore, if you want to have absolute control over the way ASP.NET behaves, and you don't want ASP.NET to sort of save you from yourself, so to speak, from making some common mistakes, then ASP.NET 4 allows you to do that as well, letting you work past some of the things that were previously there to prevent automatic errors. So that means that in our model then, what ASP.NET 4.0 really represents for web forms is a little bit of a shift back towards the center. So not being as fully abstracted in the sense that you write to ASP.NET and it decides entirely what to do. You have a little bit more control over what it does, and you can get a little bit closer to having that control over the HTML and the JavaScript that's being emitted. So this is good in the sense that it allows us as more mature web developers to create more finely tuned web applications. So one quick note then before we start looking at some demos. Some important notes. ASP.NET 4.0 is completely side-by-side enabled, meaning you can run ASP.NET 4.0 applications on a server that is also running ASP.NET 2.0 or 3.5 applications. So you can upgrade applications selectively, and there's no need, as was with the era of 2.0 or 3.5, it's a little bit less, what's that? Actually, I think my audio may have cut out there for a second, so I apologize for that. I think we're back on here. So it's a little bit different of a model, but you can run 2.0. Perfect. You can run 2.0 and 4.0 side by side. Yeah, I think I hit the mute button here, and that was my own fault. 4.0 is also backwards and upwards compatible. So what does that mean? The most important part of this statement is that it means you can take an ASP.NET 2.0 or 3.5 application today and run it on ASP.NET 4.0, and all of your code and all of the things that you have today will continue to work. If you've been around ASP.NET long enough to remember the upgrade experience from 1 or 1.1 to 2, you can remember that was anything but upwards compatible. There was a fair amount of testing, a fair amount of work that had to be done to applications to migrate them upwards. And with the newest version of ASP.NET, that is not the case. In fact, I've taken many ASP.NET 3.5 applications, simply deployed them to 4.0, and they've continued to work as expected. Are there edge cases? Sure, there always are, but generally speaking, it's easy to take an existing app and run it on 4.0. And finally, Visual Studio 2010 is a requirement if you're going to do ASP.NET 4.0 development. That obviously is because of the .NET 4.0 requirement, which is what VS 2010 supports and previous versions of VS do not. So if you're considering ASP.NET 4.0, make sure that you've downloaded a copy of Visual Studio 2010, either one of the Express editions or one of the Pro editions, and those tools will be necessary for you to work with what we're looking at today. So let's start looking at some demos. We're going to spend some time in Visual Studio, bouncing between Visual Studio and some setup information here so you can understand how to use some of these new features and really understand what they mean inside of the Visual Studio environment. Now let's go ahead and start with ViewState, because this is one of the most fundamental changes in ASP.NET 4.0 that I think will be of most benefit to you if you're coming from ASP.NET 3 or 3.5. So the new approach to ViewState is that it can be opt-in. So let me stress a few important points. This does not replace the Enable ViewState property. Enable ViewState remains, and Enable ViewState continues to be the so-called dominant property, in that if Enable ViewState is set to false, all ViewState is still disabled. If Enable ViewState is set to true, then ViewState is enabled, and the ViewState property we're looking at here, the new property called ViewState Mode, can then begin to do its work. So this is a new property added in addition to Enable ViewState. ViewState Mode allows you to selectively opt in to the ViewState process as opposed to being forced to opt out. So in previous versions of ASP.NET, that meant if you wanted one control on your page to have ViewState, you would have to turn it on at the highest level, turn it on at, let's say, the page level or the application level, and then remember to individually turn it off in all the places where it is not needed. You had to opt out. With ViewState Mode, you can do the opposite. You can turn it off at the page level, and then you can go to that one control that needs it and turn it on. So this makes it much easier to be disciplined about which controls actually use ViewState. There are 3 modes: Enable, Disabled, and Inherit. And let's take a look at Visual Studio to see how this works. So I've got a page here which has some simple labels, some simple values being set by the server so that we can see some data being put into ViewState. So let me step through these demos and we can take a look at how this works. So we'll go ahead and view this in the browser. And what we're going to see here is we've got the simple page. We can see that we're just, as I said, rendering some time into these labels, some server time, so we can see that these values are being added dynamically. And if I were to view the page source here, most important for this demo, we can see that right now ViewState is essentially empty. If you've never really examined ViewState much, an empty ViewState has 53 or 63 bytes of data in it, and that's what we see here. The default, essentially empty ViewState, 63 bytes of data. So that's because currently on my page, you can see I have Enable View State set to false. Let's go ahead and flip this to true. And go back to my page and reload this. So now our view state is enabled, and if we view the page source here, now you can see, all right, we have data going into view state. So I show you this to show you that the basic steps we're taking in this page to simply set some label values dynamically is enough to put some weight or some value into view state so we can see the effects of the view state mode property. So furthermore, with view state currently enabled, view state equals true, I can come in here and put some values like my name is LIDNUG. And I can change this to, do you want spam? No. And submit my form. And you can see that all of my values are preserved, including my selected index inside of this drop-down list. Now, there's some things here which actually don't require view state. In fact, if we were to go back to our page now, set enable view state to false, and reload this, what we actually discover is that you don't need view state for perhaps as much as you think. In fact, if I come here and set this once again to LIDNUG and change this to no and submit my form, you can see that my values, my text box is actually continuing to persist. And this is actually thanks to another aspect of the way ASP.NET works that loads postback data for us. But you see that we do lose the selected index of our drop-down list. This was changed from the no to just definitely. So if ViewState had a value for us on this one single control, everything else on the page really doesn't need ViewState. So wouldn't it be great if, rather than needing to go turn off ViewState for all these other tools, we could just turn it on for this one drop-down list? And that's what the new ViewState mode lets us do. So how does that work? Well, first of all, we have to have enable ViewState to true. If enable ViewState is false, that will override the settings of our ViewState mode property. We have to make sure that enable ViewState is true, which is typically the default value for an application. Next, I can decide what I want to do at the page level. Now, this is not a requirement. You could simply focus at the control level, but certainly working at the page level will save you some time. So I can come up here, find my new property, ViewState mode. You see that there. And here are my options. So what did we say we wanted to do? We want to turn off ViewState for all controls by default, but allow us to opt in on that one control where we need it. So I can come here to ViewState mode, set this to disabled. So that's going to turn off ViewState for all controls on my page. And I can come to the one control where I want it, let's say my drop-down list, say ViewState mode again equals enabled, and now I've turned it on for that single control. So if we go back to the browser and reload this, if I come in here and enter some values again, LIDNUG, change this to no and submit my form, you can see now my drop-down list value is persisted. I have not lost that. And if I go and view my page source, you can see while there's still some data in ViewState beyond our original so-called empty ViewState condition, it's much less than when we simply had ViewState turned on for the entire page. So without the need to be disciplined to go to each of the labels inside of Visual Studio, which I've set here dynamically, so to come to each of these individual server controls and set enable ViewState equals false, enable ViewState equals false, enable ViewState equals false, so that my one control that needs it would be left to true, I can now very easily be more disciplined about what goes into ViewState by simply setting ViewState mode disabled to ViewState mode equals disabled at the page level, and then opting in the one control that needs it. Now, there's been some confusion I've seen even while browsing the web about where you can set this. The ViewState mode property can only be set at the page level or the control level. And that also includes the master page level. It cannot be set from the web config, at least not in any successful way I've found. So if you come to the web config and try to do pages ViewState mode equals disabled, and we were trying to run this version of the page, you should see that ASP.NET will give you an error. It's not a recognized page-level tag you can set in web config. You can, however, set the enable ViewState mode here, which you've always been able to do. So if you have this set in your web config today, if you have enable ViewState set to false, be careful because, as I said, enable ViewState will override the settings of the ViewState mode property. So if we were to leave this setting, go back and run our application, and once again, view the page's source. Well, actually, let's just show you the behavior first. LIDNUG, no, submit form. You can see we did not persist our value here, which we expected to, because the enable ViewState mode at the application level has overridden my local ViewState mode equals enabled value. So be cautious, be aware of how these two properties interact, enable ViewState and ViewState mode, but take advantage of ViewState mode as a way to help you be more disciplined in how you go about putting values into ViewState and only putting the values you actually need into ViewState. So hopefully that makes some sense. To help make sure that we don't just blow past all questions that might be to a specific topic, because we're going to sort of chunk these demos into, as I said, 7 or 8 specific demos. Let me check to make sure we don't have any questions on ViewState. So I'm going to check this as best I can. And let's see if we have a specific question to ViewState. I think as we go through this, to help make sure that the questions that you add are related to the topic we're looking at, if you can just sort of in brackets at the beginning of your question put the topic, that'll help make sure that as we go through the demos, I can address the specific questions to the demo at time and the ones we can talk about at the end later. And one question here that I'll address now because it's from your fearless leader, and we'll make sure that we address it again at the end. What happens in a shared hosting environment where the host has not installed 4.0? Do you know of any shared host allowing 4.0? So of course, ASP.NET 4.0, like any version of ASP.NET, has to be installed. The framework version has to be installed on your server in order for it to be accessible. Once it's there, it's simply a matter of usually selecting an app pool that is configured to use either .NET 4 or .NET 2 plus, as I had said, 3.5. Many shared hosts that I'm aware of are already giving you this option. In fact, the one that I use most often when I'm doing shared hosting is Discount ASP, and I'm almost certain that they already rolled out their production ASP.NET 4.0 hosting. So if you're looking for shared hosting, I'm sure there are many hosts out there offering it, but certainly some of the best have already made that an option. So not seeing any specific questions about ViewState. Hopefully that all makes sense, and we can move on to talk next about control IDs. So perhaps equally important as ViewState and giving you a new way to be disciplined about ViewState is how you can go about rendering the IDs of your controls in HTML. If you've been around ASP.NET again for a while, which I imagine many of you have, we all know that one of the biggest challenges to working with ASP.NET has been the auto control ID mangling, so to speak. That would be where we look at the source for our page, especially when we're dealing with many containers, and we see that CTL00 underscore, CTL01 underscore, something, 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 eventually the control ID that I've specified. Now, of course, that has been done in the first place to kind of help save us from ourselves. Because ASP.NET is dynamic and because it can be composed at runtime of any number of user controls and user control instances and content pages and master pages, ASP.NET needed some way to ensure that the HTML that it rendered would never render multiple HTML elements that have the same HTML ID. A web page expects to only find a single element that has a specified ID, so ASP.NET was, as I said, doing this to kind of protect us from ourselves. However, we all know that that made client-side programming particularly difficult when we had these long, ugly client IDs, so ASP.NET has given us the option. We can now allow ASP.NET to operate in one of 4 control ID modes. Auto ID, which is essentially the ID mode you know and love today. This would be where you still get the automatic container naming. Static, which just as it implies, allows you to statically set the HTML ID that will be rendered to the final page. So whatever you put in the ID of the server control is the ID of the HTML control that will be rendered. Inherit, pretty obvious, takes whatever setting from its parent. And I should be clear here, because I actually passed over that. In the case of control IDs, inherit is inheriting from the naming container. And this can be a source of confusion when you try to figure out where are my control IDs getting their behavior from. Inherit is inheriting from naming container, not necessarily from its actual parent visual container. So I'll show you what that means in practice, but there's a little bit of a asterisk to that to understand. And then the default mode in ASP.NET 4.0 is predictable. And predictable is sort of an improved version of the old auto ID, in that it tries to help you render IDs that be predictable based on the container name, or if you're dealing with something like a repeater based on a repeating value from the database. And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a minute. Obviously, using this, as you can see in the slide here, simply requires that you specify the client ID mode to one of the allowed values. If you're working with something like predictable and you're working with a control that supports the client ID row suffix property, not all controls do support this, though all do support predictable, then you can specify a field, and that will be used as a part of composing the ID. You can also specify this at the global config level. So from your web config, at that pages node we looked at in the last demo, you can specify which client ID mode you want all pages to use by default, and obviously you can override that setting on a per page or per control level. So let's take a look at control IDs and try to make sure that nuance that we just described is clear. So once again, I'll run this, then we'll talk a little bit about what it's doing. So here I have a page rendering an ASP.NET literal, so just a standard server control, an ASP.NET literal server control. I am then rendering for our benefit the client ID of that server control, so we don't have to do as much view source to inspect it. So we can see the client ID for that control is currently main content underscore lit text. I am then showing you what the naming container's ID is, and so the literal naming container in this case is main content, and then stepping through the actual visual tree so you can see how do we get down to that control and what are the control ID modes for the parent naming containers of the control we're looking at. Similarly for the grid below, and in fact the naming container we're looking at right now is for the grid, and we can see how we get down to it and its final ID of my content underscore my grid. So let's start changing some things and trying to understand more about what's happening. First of all, to explain the page from a markup level, here you can see my ASP.NET literal control I specified. There's the text we saw rendered. And then down below, as I mentioned, here is my data grid. And I specified explicitly client ID mode inherit now, so we can change it in a moment. But obviously, that would be a default setting that we wouldn't have to set manually. From the code behind in this demo, all I'm doing is specifying that I want to render the client ID for my various controls. In the parent control that I'm rendering the naming container's client ID. And then to give us that tree, I'm simply setting the root control to get down to the control that we're rendering. So here, instead of my grid, I could have easily come in and put lit text. And then when we run our demo, we should be able to see that as well. So if we go back, here we can see now that the naming tree walks down to lit text, and we can see what naming container it's coming from and how the ID affects that. So let's start changing some values. Now you understand the full setup of the demo and see what happens. Let's change at the page level from the default predictable that we get with ASP.NET 4.0 to auto ID and view this in the browser. As I mentioned, auto ID is that value that sort of takes us back to ASP.NET pre-4.0 naming approach. So now you can see that the literal client ID that's being rendered by ASP.NET 4.0 is CTL00 underscore main content underscore lit text. That's kind of the ID approach that we're familiar with. And again, we can see how we walk down the tree from our site master. There's the container name to our actual main content, which is our content placeholder's name, ultimately to our literal text. If we change this from auto ID to the only other unexplored value, static, and save this and render it, we'll now see that the ID of our literal is exactly as we've specified it in the server control. The client ID renders as lit text, and we see that the IDs for all the parent containers are also being rendered literally as well. So in this case, our content placeholder is being rendered as main content. To show you the HTML source so that you can see that it's not just all magic, we can verify that. If we come in here and we find our control, here's our control. Let's see, lit text. Oh, that's my actual rendering of it. Now, in this case, it's actually a bit funny. You don't see the surrounding tags with literal text because a literal text control literally just outputs the text. It doesn't have to output a surrounding span tag. So we don't actually get to see the ID here, though, even though it conceptually exists to ASP.NET. But certainly we can see it for some of our other rendering aspects for ASP.NET. So there's a bit of a tricky thing when we inspect the HTML here with the specific controls we're using. But one of the things that we can see more clearly is if we actually look at what's happening with the grid. So with the grid right now, currently set to static, let's look at the view page source and the rendering for our grid. So here's my HTML grid. You can see the grid name exactly as specified in my server markup, ID equals my grid. And then you can see that I have a number of values here, and I'm getting this static ID, text full name, text full name, text full name for each row being rendered inside of my data-bound control. Well, while that's interesting, it's not particularly useful. I'd probably prefer to have that each of those rows renders a different value so that I can target those rows with, say, some kind of jQuery selector and do something unique. So how can I do that with this new control ID mode? Well, one option is to first just come to my grid and change it to be something different than what my page is currently set to. As we see now, our page is currently set to static. So let me override that at the control level and change the client ID mode for my grid to something like predictable. And we'll go back and render this. Actually, we'll render this first, and then we'll check the source. Actually, I wonder if that did update. That's something I've never tried to do, ironically, in Chrome. So now we can come back here, and we can see that the predictable ID of my grid has now become main content underscore my grid. And then for each row, we can see now there's this whole predictable ID, but it's become a lot longer. So we have main content underscore my grid underscore textful name underscore 0 underscore 1 underscore 2. So we've gained now this advantage of having these predictable IDs that change for each row, but we at the same time taking this penalty of having this long predictable prefix attached to each of those controls at the same time. So how can we resolve this? There's got to be a better way, and there actually is a better way. So the way you do this when you're working with a data-bound control, and if you want to have nice, clean IDs for both the grid view, the top-level control for your data-bound control, and the server controls contained within that are repeating, like this label we're looking at here, you actually need to set the client ID mode in two separate spots. So at the top level for our grid view, we'll go ahead and set this to static. And then the client ID mode for our label control we'll set to predictable. If we save this and view it back in the browser and view the page's source, now we can see that my grid has the ID that we want, that static ID of my grid. So now we can easily target that with our client-side code, exactly what we expect. And the repeating controls inside of my grid have the clean ID that we'd like as well. Textful name underscore 0, textful name underscore 1. No longer prefixed by that long, perhaps unnecessary set of the main content placeholder followed by the grid's ID and then the actual controls ID and predictable value. So by using a combination of these settings, in this case by setting the grid view to have a static control ID mode or client ID mode, and then setting the contained repeated control to have a predictable ID mode, you can see how we can combine these modes to have a better effect for how our control IDs are rendered. And that's not always entirely obvious when you sit down and start working with these new client ID modes, but it does give us that kind of power we need to render the clean markup that we want to have as modern web developers. So that's client ID mode, the three values you have, static, predictable, and auto ID, and how they are impacted and how you can actually use these to your advantage. And I encourage you to check out this demo afterwards to really explore the inner workings of what's going on here. So once again, I'll check the Q&A to make sure we don't have any questions regarding the control IDs, and it looks like we are all perfectly in sync. We all perfectly understand what I'm talking about, which is unbelievable, but I will take it and we'll move on. If you have questions about this, if it comes to you later, always feel free to log it. So let's resume. Routing. Routing is what we've all come to know and love as the way of improving or cleaning up our URLs in this ASP.NET MVC era. And obviously this has been around since the beginnings of ASP.NET MVC, and it's actually been part of ASP.NET Web Forms since ASP.NET 3.5 SP1. So this is not something entirely brand new to 4.0, but it's been improved in 4.0. We can now do a lot more with the routing features, and we have a lot more controls and power and way we can interact with the route values. So how do you use routing in ASP.NET Web Forms for 4.0? Simply, inside of your global ASAX file, in the application start, you need to define the routes that you want to be processed for your application. So we can add things like routetable.routes.add, give our route a name, define what our actual route pattern is. So in this case, we're looking for products and then some slug called category. And then, unlike MVC, and this is what's really different and improved for ASP.NET 4.0, we can simply use something called a page route handler. So if you're familiar with MVC, you know there typically we route a request to a controller, and a controller has an action and a controller name, essentially a class if you're not familiar, and that's where the request goes. In web forms, obviously we want requests to go to specific pages. So this makes it very easy for us to define that mapping simply define a new page route handler, specify the path of the page that should handle that route, and it essentially becomes like our controller. Furthermore, in ASP.NET 4.0, we can very easily pull these values out of our routed URL and use them in the page, such as using this new syntax for placing a route value directly in this case, a literal text control, route value, and then the name of the slug you're pulling. So let's take a look at this inside of some demos. Close demos we don't need, and open up page routes. So to do this, we'll just open this up in the browser, and then we'll inspect some code. Go ahead and close the rest of the tabs we don't need. So right now you can see that we're at demos/03_pageroutes.aspx. Not a very pretty demos name, probably something that we prefer to do a little bit better. So let's see if we can define a route that allows us to get to this page not using this long, ugly demos name. To do that, I obviously have to add some code to my global ASAX. So if I open that up and we look at my application start event, here you can see where I've defined some routes for my application. First, just like we do in ASP.NET MVC, I've gone ahead and included some ignore routes. Ignore routes are just as important as actual routes because it tells ASP.NET MVC which URL routes should not be processed through the routing engine. So in this case, I know that requests for web resources.axt files, I want to completely ignore and not process through my routing rules. So I'm going to go ahead and say routetables.routes.ignore, and then ignore all of my resource requests. If you're not familiar with the way ASP.NET routing works, it processes the rules from the top down. So it's a case where the first rule that matches wins. So if you have a rule that's more specific than others, you want to put it first in order because the broadest rules will ultimately catch, and those are the ones that will be used, and you want to have them towards the bottom. So first I'm going to do my ignore, then I'm going to go ahead and add my route called demo. The route path will be demos/awesome, and then some optional slug value called demo number. And then I'm mapping that to a new page route handler, demos03pageroutes.aspx. So this is the actual page we're looking at. So if I go back to my demo in the browser, what I should be able to do is instead of going to this physical page, I should be able to go to demos/awesome and then a value. And now you can see that we're taken to the same page we were looking at before. This is the same physical page, but it no longer has to be specified inside of my URL. Furthermore, that value I put at the end of my URL, in this case a 5, the so-called demo number, is being pulled and used in the page that we're seeing. How is that being done? If we look at the page, we can see it's being done in two different ways, just to show you what's possible. Inside of a ASP.NET literal control, you can see we're using that syntax we described in the slides. We're saying $route value, and then the name of the parameter from the route that we want to render in the page. So demo number is the name of that parameter that we specified for reference back in our global ASAX. Matches this name right here. ASP.NET 4.0 and the routing is smart enough to match those up, so it can automatically find those values in your route and knows what to render here. And then another way you can do this, if you're doing it in the page, programmatically, we can actually access the route data through the typical page object. So now I can say page.routeData, which gives me access to a route value dictionary, which has all the values out of my route, and then I can look for it by, once again, the key that we've defined in our route definition, demo number, and then render it to my page. So you have a number of different ways of actually being able to work with these values in the routes. There are also new options for the data source controls, which allow you to automatically pull the route values out and use them in your data source. Simply up to you how you want to work with these values, but clearly it gives you some power to improve your URLs. Beyond just the demos awesome, you can also improve simple URLs. So if I was to go to something like about, you can see that I land on the about.aspx page. So I could optionally go to about.aspx. So here's the physical page, but I can also drop the aspx and land on the same page. And that is because of my general rule I've defined in my global ASAX. So my last rule that catches everything, I've called it my root rule. I simply look for the page name and then try to find a page in the root of my website that matches that page name. So in this case, when I enter about, I'm actually being taken to about.aspx. So you can see how you can add a simple rule like this to allow you to even catch some of those high-level or top-level page names. I'm also highlighting here the optional syntax, the shorthand syntax for defining routes with web forms. rather than doing this longhand syntax we do here with routes.add, the new route, new page route handler, you can optionally simply specify a route table.routes.map page route, supply the 3 expected values, and that has the exact same effect. So it's up to you whether you want to do longhand or shorthand. There are obviously more options you can configure in the longhand approach, but for quick routes, this is a very easy way to add those to your application. Lastly, with routes, if I click on this Take Me to the Demo link, notice down below, and you may have a hard time seeing this here, so I'm going to click on it in a moment, but down in my status area, you can see that this is going to take me to demos/awesome/2. So I'll click on this, and here we are back at that page we were looking at a moment ago. The way I'm getting here is by not actually physically or hard coding a link to that route into my page. I'm using another feature of ASP.NET 4.0 routing. We'll go back to the About page here. And that is the ability to dynamically render the route URL inside of my hyperlinks. So route URL, again, and this one is actually a little bit more impressive than the others, is intelligent enough to be able to figure out which route to render based on the parameter name that I pass in here. So simply by specifying that the demo number should equal 2, it knows to go find the route that matches that parameter name and then render the appropriate URL at runtime. Which means if we were to go to our global ASAX and change this to awesomest demos, save this and build this, then when we go back to our About page, because this is not hard-coded and because it's being pulled from the routes definitions, now you can see that the rendered URL is demos/awesomest. And if we click this, we go to demos/awesomest. So all the routing features that are in MVC, in web forms, and made very easy to use, not only for defining and interacting with routes, but also for grabbing the values out of routes and consuming those inside of your web forms. Very cool, powerful stuff. So let me check on questions for that, and then we'll check on the next thing. Question 1, does debugging become more difficult because of routing? Typically not. So routing shouldn't affect debugging any more than anything else. Clearly, as you step through your debugging, you'll be able to see those route values coming through your application code, and you're still processing off the same page. So routing is simply sort of a mask within the URL. You're still hitting the same pages to execute your code. So I've not seen any instances where routing really makes debugging that much more difficult. When routing to a mapped name, if you view source, will it tell you the actual page name or the routed name? So in this case, I'm not sure exactly what you mean. If we were to view the page source here, you can see that typically a page doesn't ever explicitly specify its page name or its physical page name in the rendered source. If you had code that was doing that, I suppose that you would still see that, depending on what your code looked like, to render the page's name. But traditionally, we don't see that page's name in its rendered source. Furthermore, if the question is more about what do we see in the HTTP response, that is also typically not the physical page name, but the response from where the request was made. So if I use the developer tools in Chrome here, enable resource tracking to reload this page, you can see I make a request to /demos/awesomest/2, and I'm returned a response from there, but in no place do I see the actual physical page name. So typically, once you're using routing to the end user, it'll simply look like that's where the request is going and coming from. And can you do regex matching, or can you do regex for matching? And absolutely. So just as we have all those powers and capabilities in MVC in the routing to do things like regex for matching our routes, we can still do that inside of ASP.NET Web Forms as well, and that's where the longhand syntax comes into place. So while I've simply gone ahead and defined a new page route handler, if I come in here and show you some of the additional overloads, you can see that you have things like route value dictionary constraints, and you can specify data tokens. There are all kinds of things you can do. There are all the things that you've been able to do with MVC. You can come in and configure and customize inside of ASP.NET Web Forms as well. So you absolutely have those options to come in here and tweak the routes and add that power. So I think there's one more question we'll address. What happens when you have some parameters for the same parameters for multiple routes? So that's absolutely a good question. That's one of the questions I had. So if ASP.NET is not able to figure out which route matches, by default, as with other things in routing, the first match will win. But if you want to be more explicit than that, you can specify the route name. So because we have this name token we provide that does give our routes a unique ID, you can go ahead and specify that route name to explicitly control which route should be matched. You definitely have the ability to do that as well. Good questions. So kind of related at the same time are some of the new APIs you have in ASP.NET 4.0. And we won't touch on all these, but I'll simply highlight them and then look at one. For our page metadata, we have a few APIs that make this just a little bit easier. It's not really ever been that much of a problem in the past, but it has required us to do some workarounds because there wasn't just a direct access to our page description or meta keywords, and now you have direct access to those from the page level object. I'll skip over to the next one and come back to it. We also have updated browser capability files. So in ASP.NET, the browser capability files indicate to the framework what features a browser supports, and now it's been updated to include all the mobile browsers, things like mobile Safari and the browsers that weren't around in the last version of ASP.NET. All those browsers are in this now, so now the ASP.NET framework will behave as expected for those targets. One of the ones that you'll use probably most often, or you should be using most often, is the new response.redirect permanent. This is new. Before this, all we had was response.redirect, and the main difference is the HTTP response code that is issued while doing the redirect. So if we were in a room together again, I'd probably ask you what is the HTTP code that the original response.redirect issues, and the correct response would be HTTP 302. Which is, in HTTP lingo, which is what's read by search engines, a temporary redirect. So when we use an HTTP 302 or response.redirect, we're simply telling a search engine that this page is temporarily moved, come back and check here again next time because it might be here next time. Which is not great for SEO if we're using response.redirect on a page which we never want to have indexed. So it would be a much better thing to use an HTTP 301, which is a moved permanently. And we now have an easy way to do that with 4.0 with the redirect permanent API. So to show you that, and another quick option for that, we'll come here to our redirect page. Now clearly we should never see this page because when we open it, we're actually going to be firing off a response.redirect. And to show you that, here I'm doing a standard response.redirect to the about page from our page load event. So we'll go ahead and view this in the browser. We see that we originally started on that page, but then we end up on the About page. So to see something more interesting, let's go ahead and look at our resources here and our response code. Let's go back to the page we started on, Demos. We'll load that up. We can see that we issue a request for our Demos page, or our 04 HTTP redirect page, and you can see the response we get back is a 302. So there's what response.redirect is doing, a temporary redirect, and we end up on the About page. With the new API, we have a couple of options. We can do response.redirect permanent, which is just like redirect, only with a different code. So I could say response.redirect permanent to about.aspx. And if I save this and viewed this in the browser, save Shift F6. And now we'll go back to our original page again, Demos. And now the original request, if we inspect our response, we can see that we get a 302 again. So I clearly did not save and reload this in the correct way, or I didn't comment out the first line. First one wins. So let's go ahead and try that again. Now we should get what we expect, Demos. And now if we look at the response code, we can see that, in fact, we do get a 301 moved permanently. So now we can see how that's helping us improve the response codes we're sending with redirects. The other nice thing about the new API is we also have the option to do response.redirect to route. And we have both options, redirect to route and redirect to route permanent. And that allows us to simply, once again, specify the route we want to redirect to. And again, that intelligence is being built in here to automatically figure out the route based on the parameter name I'm passing in. And to the questions that were there before, of course, you can specify an actual route name here as well. But if I save this and we look at this in the browser, so go back here and once again go to our original start page, our Demos, and reload this. Now we're being redirected to /demo/awesomeness so that we can see that route value we changed is being used again there, and we can see that the redirect code is a 301. So that's another API kind of related to what we were looking at before with routing that's also beneficial to you with the new redirect. So take advantage of that in your code as well so you can fully leverage the routing features in your application code. So that's redirecting, and I think that this is to the previous topic, so we'll come back to that at the end so we can move forward without going backwards. Two more major topics I want to touch on with demos, and then some more minor ones. And if I remember correctly, let me check back to Visual Studio. Let me see if I can get out of this. Yeah, so we've got about 30 minutes, so that should be good. So just want to make sure we have time to touch on these things fully and make sure we have time for your questions as well. So output caching. Output caching has long been one of the benefits of ASP.NET in that it allows us to very easily take control over how often our pages are being regenerated, so that in situations where we perhaps are optimizing our site for scalability, where we're not rendering the page on every request, we can tell the ASP.NET infrastructure to go ahead, render our page once, put it into some kind of cache, and then don't render it again for some set period of time or until some sort of set flag changes. It allows us to take some of the load off of our server. Until 4.0, however, there's only been one type of output caching, and that has been memory-based output caching. So that means on servers that are particularly being heavy hit by requests, where we're using output caching, we're actually stealing some of that server's memory to put the cached versions of our pages into its active memory collection. So there have been workarounds that have been outside of the framework we could use, obviously, to solve this problem. But finally, with ASP.NET 4.0, we get provider-based output caching, which means it's very easy to create any kind of output cache provider or output cache strategy that you want for your pages. As an example, we could go ahead and create a disk-based cache provider. And with a disk-based output cache provider, rather than putting our output cache pages into memory, we could actually save them to the physical disk, which could have a hit for the I/O that costs, but could be a benefit for pages that are maybe not accessed as often. So to specify a cache provider from the web config, quite simply, we come to the caching output cache section, specify the new name of our cache provider, and then obviously the type. And then to opt into using this, we can do it on a per page or per control or user control level. In the output cache parameter, we can specify the provider name and then opt into that cache type. So let's take a look at this in a custom cache provider. So go ahead and close this and open up cache extensibility. So here I have, once again, a simple page to keep things clear. We have our standard render current server time, so we can keep track of whether we're seeing a page that's currently been rendered or some sort of cached version. And then we're loading our time as well from the code behind being set programmatically here as well. And I'll explain once again how this is working after we load it, but you can see that I've specified my output cache variable duration to 5, so 5 seconds, and we're varying by param none. It's important that you include that as well. So we'll go ahead and view this in the browser. We can see that the page loads. We can see 207.34. If I hit F5, 34, hit F5 again, there we get 40. So this is going to be refreshing. We should get time change every 5 seconds. So 45, there we go, so we get 46. We can see that this is, in fact, being cached. However, this is not being cached as standard in-memory cache. I'm actually using a disk-based cache here. How do we know? Well, because I've configured it in my web config. So if we come to my web config here and we look at my caching, you can see while I have a default provider, ASP.NET internal provider, I've also added a provider called disk output cache of type disk output cache provider. The code for that I've included inside of this demo application, and if we look at that, we can see that it's a very simple implementation that allows us to simply put in and out of cache our output cached version of our ASP.NET file. This code is borrowed from 4 guys from Rolla, I believe. There's a link in the demo, so you can go explore this in the article around it fully. But the nice thing about this is it's also creating a log file showing us what's happening as we interact with our disk-based cache. So if we were to come view in our Windows Explorer where this is being saved, I'll go ahead and refresh this to make sure we got the latest version. Here you can see, here's that cached output version of our page. So if I open this with Notepad, we can see we've got this serialized version of our cached output page. There's that time. There's that 46, the last version we saw in our browser. And more importantly, here's this log file that helps us see how our cache file is working. We can see those requests being made to our get or return, rather, our cached version of the page until it expires. Here we see this expiring notice, and then return a new version. So this is simply for debugging to kind of show us that, yes, in fact, we're going through our disk-based cache provider, but you can see the effect is the same. Without needing to change anything other than a config setting in web config, our page is being routed out to our disk-based cache. Well, some of you, the eagle-eyed observers in the audience might be saying, well, wait a second. Where have you told that page to opt into that cache output model, since the default is still the ASP.NET internal cache? You would get bonus points and swag if I could throw it to you. So the answer is there's a little bit more being done in this example in my global ASAX. And here I'm showing you the option you have to dynamically route specific pages to a specific cache provider. So here's again under that umbrella of getting the most out of ASP.NET 4.0. If you were to use something like a disk-based cache provider, you probably wouldn't want to put all of your files in the disk-based cache because there is that penalty for accessing and reading and writing to the disk. So perhaps the strategy you might want to use is a strategy where your top 10 most actively viewed pages are put in and pulled from memory, which is much faster. And then your less actively used pages are cached to disk, where you don't chew up server memory, and then pulled from disk as needed. So in this very simple approach, I'm simply checking the request path. If it ends with extensibility.aspx, I'm returning my disk output cache provider. Otherwise, I'm using the default output cache provider, in this case, the in-memory provider. So whatever logic you build in here can be used to determine which pages get processed by which cache provider, which gives you a lot of control over creating a strategy around how you implement caching in ASP.NET 4.0. That is output caching. So we've got one more major demo to look at, and then we'll make sure we have some time for your questions, and we'll wrap up on that note. Before we get there, extending the note on extensibility and caching, there are lots of newly extensible things in ASP.NET 4.0. So in addition to output caching, object caching is also extensible. You can create custom object cache providers. You can create a custom invalid path characters provider. So if you want to customize the way invalid path characters are determined, you can do that. You can change the way request validation works. You can even create your own custom implementation of HTTP or HTML and URL encoding. So you have control over the encoders. And of course, you can extend and customize the browser capability files. So many things which in ASP.NET versions previous to 4 have been fixed, unable to change, at least without lots of effort, are now easy to change and customize, once again, putting you in control of the way ASP.NET behaves. Additionally, we have some new controls. So here's sort of the UI level, some new things that we can actually use in our web forms. One of the more major new controls is the query extender. And query extender is a simple control which allows you to, I would say for simple applications, easily expose some filtering APIs or some filtering UI, perhaps more accurately, to your users. And we'll look at this in just a second. Many of the other controls, meanwhile, have been improved. The list view control no longer requires that obviously seemingly pointless and annoying placeholder control. That no longer is a requirement, which is a big boost if you've been working with list view. Form view has been improved, the paging, lots of controls that used to render outer tables somewhat unnecessarily no longer render that unnecessary HTML. And the hidden divs that are rendered around the hidden input fields like ViewState now have CSS options that are based on CSS class names instead of using inline styles, so that we can once again take better control over the way even those hidden divs are being rendered and placed. So let's quickly take a look at the query extender. I would lie to you before, there's two more demos. So query extender first. I'll show you this and then we'll look at the code. So query extender is actually a non-visual control. Query extender does not provide any UI of its own, but it does provide functionality to work with the link data source and the entity data source. That's currently the only two data sources that the query extender works with. And what it essentially allows you to do is give your users the power to build the where clause for your data-bound link data source controls. So in this case, I can come in here and specify, let's say, MAR, click search, and you can see that I get all contact names and technically all company names that have MAR, and we get my list filtered down. How is this being done? On my page, you can see that here's where I built my little filtering UI. I have to provide that UI on my own. The UI is not provided by the query extender, so I simply provide a text box and a button to do my searching. I then have a standard grid view control, which is bound to a link data source. And then I have my link data source, which is bound to my Northwind data context, which I've previously created, and a table name called customers, which is where my data is coming from. Then we add to that, the new part of all this, the query extender. How does query extender get configured? I give it a target control ID. This should be the ID of either your link or entity data source control. So here I specify link data source 1. I can then specify any number of search expressions or different types of filter expressions. So if I show you the IntelliSense on this, you can see we have a lot of different filtering options of type expression, order by expression, property expression, range expression. So lots of ways we can use the query extender to apply shaping to our data source data. In this case, I've decided to use a search expression. I've specified the data fields separated by a comma that I want to apply my search type to. So company name and contact name. And I've said the search type I want to use is starts with. And when I use search type, my options are starts with, contains, and ends with. So we say starts with, and then I'm automatically grabbing the value out of my text search text box. So that text box I created in my UI. Simply by dropping this markup into my page, it's automatically going to use the iQueryable return nature of my linked data source to apply shaping to my data, in this case, a filter based on my search query, that will be pushed all the way back to the database before the results are returned to the server. So this is actually applying the filtering, applying the shaping to my data on the database server, not in memory, where we bring back all records and then filter in the application memory. So that's the advantage of using the query extender. It's simply an easy way to expose this kind of filtering to your users. Otherwise, query extender is not more complicated than that. So because the last demo is actually kind of fun, we'll move on to that so we can wrap up. I guess before we get there, I want to make a note to you, and this is actually a little bit more accurate note now that we have the news from this week. Client-side libraries. Since we're not really talking about it today, I'll simply make the note. The Microsoft Ajax libraries are dead, but long live jQuery. What does that mean? It means that if you're doing new client-side development, use jQuery. We've had the Microsoft ASP.NET client-side libraries for a while now, since the introduction of ASP.NET 2.0. They've evolved through 3 and 3.5 SP1. They've been very useful, but Microsoft has made it very clear that ongoing for them, all of their future investment in client-side libraries is being done in jQuery, not in the client-side libraries. So does that mean they're not supported? No, they're absolutely still supported. You can absolutely still use them. They're still great fundamentals. They're just not being evolved any further. So if you want to do client-side development, if you want things like client-side templates or some of the new fun things being done for rich client-side applications, the mainstream recommendation from Microsoft is to use jQuery. And as of this week, Microsoft has formally announced that some of their plugins have been accepted by the jQuery core. So the new templating plugin, the data context, all that now will be making its way to jQuery 1.5. It's available now as plugins. So jQuery and Microsoft are showing how that collaboration is working. And as a side note, jQuery does ship with ASP.NET 4.0, so it's out of the box. It comes with the framework, and it is officially supported by Microsoft. So if you have to have help with it, you can get that from Microsoft. And last major demo for the day, dynamic data. Core benefits of dynamic data is that it gives your application model-driven validation, and it gives you the very handy and useful field templates, which allow you to specify a template for working with a specific data type, and then have that template automatically rendered whenever you encounter that data type in your UI. So the obvious example here is when you're working with date time, having a calendar date picker rendered whenever that kind of field's rendered in a form. Previous to ASP.NET 4.0, dynamic data probably is not something a lot of you worked with because it was kind of an all-or-nothing approach. You either use dynamic data and its dynamic scaffolding, or you didn't use it at all. And there technically was a gray area where you could configure it to work with web forms, but it wasn't particularly easy to do. With ASP.NET 4.0, I encourage every one of you, if you don't do anything else after today's demo, to check out the way that dynamic data has been added to web forms to make it much easier to use. We can now enable certain controls like the grid view to use dynamic data by simply specifying server-side gridview.enable dynamic data, the type of the model object that we're working with, and then the values that we want to go into that. In this case, we're providing some overrides. So really what's important here is we can specify a single property, enable dynamic data, and deliver all that functionality to the control. Optionally, we can do this declaratively without doing it programmatically, where we use the dynamic data manager, and this simply has the same effect of allowing us to specify our data controls on the page as opposed to doing it from code. So let me show you how this is pretty cool. In our last demo here, we've got a grid view once again on our page, and we're once again binding it to our Northwind data. And then I'm using a details view, an ASP.NET details view, to show the details for a selected order. So this is an order detail basic form. If we view this in the browser, you'll see that. Here's my collection of orders. Here's my collection of order details. If I select an order, we can see that the details show up down here below. So Tom SP. Now what's cool about this is that in my code behind, I've gone the code behind route here, I've simply specified on my grid view and on my details view, enable dynamic data, and specified the type of the objects that I'm working with. So enable dynamic data, type of order, and again for my details view. By simply doing this, 2 lines of code, in my browser, when I come here to, let's say, my freight, and I try to put in a value like 2,000, and I tab out of that, notice that I get automatic validation. It's showing me that that value is not good, and if I hover over that, you see I get the message, what are you thinking? Now, that's probably not something ASP.NET came up with on its own, so where's that coming from? On my model, here you can see I have my Northwind model. I've specified some metadata, and using data annotations, I've gone ahead and specified for a couple of the values inside of my order object that, for instance, the freight value should have a range validator to accept ranges between 0 and 1,000, and if they're not in that range, to give the error message, what are you thinking? For my ship name, I've specified that that just simply must be required. It can't be blank. So if I were to go back to my form and go to my ship name right here and delete that and tab out of that field, you can see we get a validation message there as well. Ship name field is required, so there's the default message. So the cool thing is here, I'm getting dynamic data automatically render all of my control field validation, typically a very time-consuming step when we're building forms in ASP.NET, by simply putting data annotations on my model. So my annotations live in one place, or my model validation lives in one place, and then enabling dynamic data on my controls. So very cool way to bring this sort of higher-level dynamic data functionality to everyday grid views and details views, form views, etc. inside of ASP.NET Web Forms. Further, we can do things like I can change the display order on a field. So I can come here and set display order for my freight field to 0, and this is a UI hint for dynamic data, where if I rebuild my project and view it in the browser, we can now see that in my details view, when the page loads, freight has now become the first field listed inside of my details view. So dynamic data gives us the ability to do things like that as well. So this is really cool because it doesn't force you to copy a folder into your project. If you look at my solution, I've not copied some sort of extensive folder structure into my project with bunches of templates and things to make dynamic data work. I've not done a lot of extra configuration steps. One property to enable it. As long as I've got some metadata there on my object for it to read from, it can pull that into my project, and then I get some of those benefits and features of dynamic data in a web forms application. And a question before we move on. Will this be available for reworking later? I'd like to send it to some coworkers. That is a great question for the LIDNUG leadership, and I believe the answer is yes. I think they record these things and make them available, but I'll definitely confirm with them. I'll certainly be making the slides available. I'll talk about that in just a second.
Can I just interrupt in there, Todd?
Sure.
Yeah. Yes, we will be making them available now that we've got the new website up and running at www.lidnug.org. You'll find that and a lot of our past ones in the archives, and we're getting them all up online as fast as we can, guys. So just head on straight over a couple of days after we're finished here, and it should be available.
Perfect. So then let's wrap up. Now more flexible. Yeah, that's what we just saw. jQuery and MVC, I mentioned that we'd lightly touch on that, and so here's the light touch. They're now baked into ASP.NET. So if you've overlooked these in the past, either because they didn't ship with ASP.NET Web Forms proper, or because you had to install extensions or download something, both of these technologies are now out of the box with .NET 4.0, with ASP.NET 4.0. So now's a great time to jump into those if you've not started looking at them or using them, because certainly they'll make you more ready for the future of web development. In that case, specifically talking about jQuery. And as we look to the future of what's next, what's coming down the pipeline, something else for you to be aware of is some new things coming from Microsoft called Razor and Web Matrix. And corresponding with that is ASP.NET Web Pages. So Microsoft is delivering a new tool really focused on the streamlined, simplified approach to building websites using a new syntax called Razor and a new page type called ASP.NET Web Pages. As we talked about at the beginning of today's presentation, all of this is still .NET under the umbrella of ASP.NET. It's just a new approach that, as you can see in the example here on the right, simplifies some of the markup that can become heavy, especially if you've started to work with the MVC approach to doing development. So a nice, clean way to do development if you're moving in that MVC direction. If not, though, it's also interesting to look at because the Web Matrix tool is a very integrated environment for building and deploying websites that are driven off of databases, very targeted at web development. So not as much distraction as you get perhaps in Visual Studio, which is more broadly targeted at development. So 2 tools and a technology for you to check out. And other things for you to do on your own, because obviously when we start talking about ASP.NET 4.0 and .NET 4 in general, it's a huge surface area that has lots of room for exploration. So here's your homework for research if you want to really master all of what's new in ASP.NET 4.0. Check out some of the changes that have been made to the way the ASP.NET server controls render. They've been made a little bit more accessible, a little bit more functional. If you ask me, obviously I've got a bit of perspective on this coming from an ASP.NET UI component vendor. I'd say that these are changes more or less a little too little, a little too late. Things like fixing which page index is remembered as you page through a grid in ASP.NET. Many of these problems you've already solved by using third-party controls from companies like Telerik, but nonetheless, if you're still using those out-of-the-box controls, then for the 10 of you, this is your solution. There are many new control features. The client controls and AJAX libraries, as I said, not necessarily something that you want to use in production. I think it's some great work that Microsoft did, but we all know now that the real investment in that and the future in that work is going to be in the jQuery plugins, so kind of shift your attention there. There are improvements to IIS and the deployment model, improvement to VS 2010 and how you can deploy web config and do build time web config changes. And, of course, the new features in ASP.NET MVC2 and very soon MVC3 are out there for you to inspect and enjoy as well. Ultimately, I know what you're saying. It's too much. We spent an hour and a half talking about all these new things in ASP.NET. How can I even begin to comprehend and use it all in addition to what you're assigning me for homework? I appreciate your attention and your patience as we work through this. It is a lot, but it's all designed to help you and make you a better, more powerful web developer. So check it out. Remember to try at least one of these things on your own. And thank you guys very much for your time today.
Well, another good presentation there, Todd.
Thank you very much.
I forgot what I was going to say.